Hello, this is Frank Morelli, and I'm happy to be able to introduce you to the Barton-Morelli gout-shaped profiled cane. Uh, we'll start with an introduction to explain to you about this cane. Throughout, you'll be able to see some dimensions on one side of the screen, and including my reed map, which shows the best places to scrape this style of reed, the little bit that you have to scrape it. And oh, by the way, you will notice that there's some black smudges on the blanks that I'm using at times, and that is because I was using pencil to demonstrate some of the scraping as we go along. Uh, Hope this is helpful to you.
You can see that the spine, even in terms of topographically, if you will, you can see the way it was profiled, creates that spine from the back to the front, right up into from what you call the spine up to, I guess in the front we call often the heart. You will also see that there are channels down the front, down from the back to the front, and you can see them in the light. And then in the corners, you can see, of course, the corners are lighter, but you can see there's a substantial amount of cane in there. Hopefully not some of this is, well, no, it isn't really. I was going to say some of the pencil, but I don't think there's really that much pencil there left. So that's a Morelli Reed. That's how this cane is designed to work. Rails that go from back to front with a kind of even smoothness of change. You'll also notice that it goes pretty much, and this was Mr. Maxim's design, pretty much the spine goes directly up into the collar. So you're blowing into the reed, you're leaning against that collar. Also, the concept was that you're blowing right into the bocal. Also, that we get the reed to respond, and you would take more wood out of this reed if you need to, more by taking a little bit more out of the channels or bringing on a rail, so sometimes fatten up the second day. But you're not going to be taking a lot of wood out of the front of the reed. I can't really point to that right now, the way I'm holding things. So this gives you a sense of how this Barton-Morelli profile is supposed to work. By the way, the shaper is designed from the 1A shaper of Rieger. The throat and tube are pretty much the Rieger 1A, or exactly, I mean, it's assuming they did what I requested. But the flare of the reed is taken in 1 millimeter, is approximately half on each side, obviously. In a straight line, as you can see, there's no curve to the shaper. It's very straight from the throat, from around the collar up to the tip. I always found the 1A cane to be quite excellent if I sanded down the sides, say when students brought in reeds. So I thought, why sand down the sides if I can have them make me a shaper that does that work in advance? Good luck. The distance from the collar, and I put the first wire right at the collar on the bark side, of course, the tube side. If you measure from the collar to the front, it's 1.25 inches, 1 inch and 4/16, or about 32 millimeters. I will cut the reed using the collar and wire, which the butt of, butting up, you might say, your ruler against the wire at the collar. I will cut one of those 16ths off to about 1 inch and 3/16 once it's soaked. And that equals, as I recall, about 33 centimeters, 30 millimeters. I know that's long for some people, but that's what this reed is designed to go really between there and no less than about 28.5 millimeters from the collar. Now the collar itself, I use the term collar, but the point is not to have a collar, a deep cut collar, especially on the spine. As I showed you with that other scrape, there is a certain, you might take a little bit of make a bit of a collar on either side of the spine, not on the spine, and not going down the center of the reed, the spine, or into the heart at the front. Also, this reed I haven't opened yet. It's pretty round already. I want to work on the reed with the tube pretty much rounded, closer to cylindrical than to any sort of a flattened look, more of an oval look. I want it to be more equal in roundness at the front end of the reed. Also, you'll see 4 wires. I don't wrap my reeds, so I use the extra wire to help stabilize it. I just use 3 coats of nail polish generally. The distance between the first wire, which is at the collar, and so what I measure is from the top of the first wire, meaning at the collar end side of the first wire, down to the bottom of the second wire. You know, it's the 2 wires that are the second wire, the bottom one of those 2. It turns out to be 3/8 of an inch. It's just, I believe, if I recall, under a centimeter. I use inches, but I understand if you want to use. Right, it's pretty close to a centimeter. So and again, the centimeter or 1/8 of an inch, 3/8 that I mentioned, is measuring from the top of this wire to the bottom of that wire. I put the bottom wire about, about 3/16 or something like that from the end of the reed. Well, actually about I guess about an eighth of an inch. Yeah, about an eighth of an inch. So it's about an eighth of an inch, maybe a little bit more, and then the other wire somewhere up around there. For me, the placement of those 2 wires isn't as crucial, but they shouldn't be too high up. The placement of the first wire at the collar and the other wire being the 3/8 inch down or centimeter down, as I described, that's important. And the roundness of the tube, that's important. The other thing I do, although with this cane, you probably don't have to ream it if you shape it properly, form it properly, I mean, is you might take a little bit off, you check it against your bocal while it's still dry and see how well it's seating on the bocal. Better to ream out reeds when they're dry, again, to get a better quality cut. It doesn't shred, it gets more like, comes off more like, I guess you could call it sawdust. So that's the dimensions of the reed. I do not cut off the tube. The tube is designed to be the length it is, which is like an inch and 3, almost an inch and an eighth, you know, about an inch and an eighth, give or take, very close to it. In my opinion, you should never be measuring the reed from the butt because cane can come at different lengths. Most cane is 120 millimeters. And the point for me is that the fold, the tip, when you fold it over, that's always the center. So even if you don't fold it over exactly, this measurement is always true. The distance between the tip and the collar is always true based upon the profile. And so I don't understand why people measure from the back, because the distance between these 2 points may not be the same all the time, depending on the length of the piece of cane or how you folded it. This shape is longer. It's meant to be cut longer, thinner than some. The idea of the center line and not too much out of at the collar is so that you support up against, you use your support to meet the resistance of the back of the reed, but that allows you, because you are meeting the resistance on the back of the reed, it allows you to have the front of the reed be a little lighter and quite responsive. One must use their eye to decide how much to take off of the rails. So you have to look at the side of the rail, look on it, the profile of the rail, so to speak, and only take off as much as needed. The key is take a little bit off, use a file, and go on to the surface of the blade for about 2 millimeters. Do not bend the file way down. Don't slump it off. So you want to maintain the square edge of the rail. You do not want it to become curved or stoop-shouldered, you might say. So that won't need very much work at all. But that's the first step I do while the reed is unclipped and dry. The next step is to take some off of the channels from the back to, say, about, what is that, 3/4 away towards the tip. Again, with the tip unclipped and the reed dry. I'll do it on the other side so that you can see where the cane comes off. At about that much at the most. And you can see it starts to create, it really helps to create spine down the middle. There would have been cane taken off here by having done the rails first on all four sides with the file, as I showed you previously.
The dark line going across near the tip of the reed indicates how far back my profiler scrapes from.
Whether or not you want to use a tip finisher, I use a tip finisher. It won't take off very much with this Barton cane because it's so close to being the final version. I'll show you how that works after this. I want then to take some extra. We worked here on the channels in general from pretty much the back up to here. Then I take what I call using this kind of scrape now from the front end of the channels, going from, I guess, a little less than halfway between the front and the back, from the tip to the back, and like one long scrape. I took another like 10. I'll do the other side to show you how it would be on this side as well. So you can see how it's taking the cane off here. If you recall, this side I haven't done the channels to yet. I could do that now that we're in this position. And so you would start to see a little bit more pronounced spine. You can see that a little bit in this video. At the same time that the channels have had some wood taken out of them, and the rails would have had some taken out of them. All this still being done while it's dry and unclipped. So to just keep this side of the reed, make sure I'm keeping it even with the other side. Thus far, we've talked about the rails, the channels, the back of the channels, the front of the channels, and another scrape I sometimes do, maybe a little less with the Barton cane, but on my other old profiling, which was thicker, wasn't as well done as this profiling, I might take two or three really short scrapes right at the collar, but not on the spine. And that's that's on the reed map as well. You'll see that. So you have at the collar, the channels, the sort of general channels and the front end of the channels and the rails. And that pretty much covers all this real estate from here to there, obviously would be on all four sides or all four quadrants of the reed, both sides of the reed. All this I do, all this I do before the reed is cut, is clipped open or soaked. The last one I just showed you, that might wait until after I've tried the reed out. And you could either do it this way, the way I do it, which is this way, which Mr. Maxim, my teacher, used to do, is I put the knife at the collar and I pull towards myself this way. So I'm just scraping that way, not digging in. That's the way I accomplish that. That can wait until you've tried the reed out. Now we use a clean reed I'm going to get the pencil from showing you on another blank to show you, to give you the benefit of the reed using having put a pencil on it so you could see where the scrapes were better. But here, I would say I want to take a little bit at the back end of the reed on the rail, the way I was showing you before, going on a couple of centimeters onto the rail, onto the surface of each side of the blank. So it doesn't take much because Barton has really done the job for you already. Then a little bit on the other side, of course, the same. I like to do it this way and follow, being able to see what I'm doing as I do my work and not from away from me. I don't like using a knife because there's too much chance that I'm going to be able to nick the reed. I did the rails, so now I will do the channels as I showed you on the reed with the black on it. So I've taken some off the rails, some off the front end of the regular channels, or what we call basically the channels from the back. And then I do, as I showed you, the front end of the channels. I am not hitting the spine, as you saw in the reed that had been blackened with a pencil. And I count how many scrapes so that I try my best in my imperfect way of keeping the reed balanced. And that's it. That's the work I do before I have to soak it and clip it. So I clipped this clean reed that I have soaked to 1 inch and 3/16, as I showed you I would do. I still believe that amounts to 3 centimeters or 30 millimeters. I'll double check again, as I don't use that measurement all the time. Right. So I cut it to that length. Now I understand many people feel that is too long. But this reed is designed this way, so you should try it if you're gonna try this cane. Then, assuming there's not a scary crack in the back, I try not to do that, but sometimes they exist. I would round the tube a little more, having shaped it. Having shaped it, and having formed it. It was already shaped. Having formed it and not wanting to overly round it. So I always push a little below the second wire to round the tube, then on the second wire, which of course closes the reed, and then I can round open the first wire somewhat. You never want it to go past being round. You don't want it to go past being overly rounded so that it would start to become oval the other way. That would not be good. And you see how it's opening, and that looks pretty good so far. So now, this is a reed that is right off the profiler, just been clipped after what I showed you I did, doing a little bit on the rails and channels. So as you can see, that's the first notes off of this reed. That's the first notes off of this reed. I've done nothing to the tip. And what I do now is put it on a tip finisher. And I'll show you what the tip finisher takes off next. I leave the tip of the blade, when I put it on the plaque, about 1 millimeter back from the line here, because I don't want to cut quite as far back as the rigger is designed to do. So I'm going to show you on the other side now, and then I'll tell you what the differences were. The reed may have dried out slightly, but anyway, close enough. You will see that I'll take it off. More or less towards the front of the reed, a little bit was taken off and not much here. I can tell you because I measured it sort of in these places that you see here. And the differences basically were pretty much 1 to 2 thousandths of an inch in these two difference. The rest about 1/1000th of an inch. Now that's, using my equipment, done in a way as carefully as I can, but not, I wouldn't call it ultimately scientific. But the point being, it takes very little work at the tip to get this reed going. Okay, I washed off that same reed so I wouldn't ingest too much lead from the pencil. I could see maybe taking those couple of scrapes at the wire I showed you at the collar. But this is, so the first note's off this reed now. Now, I mentioned about maybe taking a couple of scrapes at the wire. So I'm taking 2 very short scrapes. You could also do it the other way using your thumb, but the way people are more used to doing it. In other words, I'll show you like this. Let's say just a couple of scrapes right at the wire. So it is developing a slight collar, but not on the spine. That lowers the crow a little bit, makes it a little more responsive. Then the other favorite for me is there's just a slight bit of resistance going across middle C, B, C, D, E, which often is in the instrument. I play on a light string bassoon, which really doesn't have that problem, but I do detect a slight bit, and so then I would do a little more on the front end of the channels I mentioned to you before. And it's on the reed map showing you where they are. So I put in my plaque. I'm scraping from about halfway up the reed between the collar and what is now the tip, and one scrape's worth. I'll take like 5 light scrapes just forward, from the back and forward, not hitting the spine, not hitting the rail. If you imagine that each side of this was a median and it was a 2-lane road, then I ran right down the middle of each lane of the road, neither on the median, hitting neither curb, running straight down the middle of the road on that side. So I took that extra 5 out. Now, I don't know what kind of sound we're going to get on my phone, just propped up like this, but it gives you a sense that this is instant reed. And we worked to get this reed, the kind of reed I make, to be that accessible to you when you first get it, because I realize people will find this kind of reed a little heavier than they're used to. I'll see if I can show you kind of what the profile, the silhouette looking through looks like, against some light. Okay, this is not perfect way to do this, but you can see that the spine, even in terms of topographically, if you will, you can see how just those few extra scrapes and the way it was profiled creates that spine from the back to the front, right up into from what you call the spine up to, I guess in the front we call often the heart. You will also see that there are channels down the front, down from the back to the front, and you can see them in the light. And then in the corners, you can see, of course, the corners are lighter, but you can see there's a substantial amount of cane in there. Here at the top, you can see the A, as on the reed map,
I have a few lines crossing one another, so it's a little harder to see. That's the part one would do using sandpaper. Let's say if this were sandpaper, and sanding at the tip. We'll review all of that. Then I have added what I'm calling now that delta wing as an A prime. So on this side, it would go from the A point to the corner on the other side, making quite a wide open V if you went from the other direction than over here. And of course, its counterpart would be from here up to there. So that's a new scrape, or a new scrape that I've added to the list of scrapes from before. Then you have F, which I call the mid-tip scrape, and G, which is the hinge, and that's what Mr. Maxim called it. Here's the front end of the channel, C. The rails themselves, B, on both sides, of course. This would also appear on the other side, C. H is the standard channels, not on the spine, not on the rail, sort of running in the middle of the road on either side, and of course it would be on both sides. Again, for the sake of this diagram, I didn't draw everything on each side. It's confusing enough as I've done it. And then back at the collar, one can do a few scrapes at the wire, just going a few centimeters forward. Obviously, this is a larger version. I tried to keep it to scale as much as I could. Again, not on the rail, far on the rail, not on the spine. We're basically leaving the spine alone, especially on the Barton cane in my profile, and that profile especially because it's on the thinner side. You have the far corners, here E, which would go from here to here. The reason I have F and E together is if you were lining up to do the mid-tip scrape on this side, you'd start here and basically aiming your knife there. You'd get sort of that line. And of course, the other side. Now, as far as G goes, the more acute angle, right, as opposed to an open angle, then you would be going more or less from this same E position, but out in the middle of the reed, heading for the center. That's why I called that point G, which is the midpoint. E and F, these are sighting, you might say sight lines. So if one were to use the actual knife, you're going from E to do the far corner. You're going from E over the F on the other side, and it's 2/3 of the way over to get more of the mid-tip scrape. You're going from the midpoint, you might say, of E out here to G to the center to get your hinge area. But even as I've drawn these, you're not going all the way to the rail nor all the way to the center when speaking about the mid-tip scrape or the hinge area. When you're doing that delta wing, as I call it now, that is something that's going more or less completely along the reed in both directions. And of course, when one is sanding the tip, one tries to do it evenly all the way across. So really there are three, you might say three scrapes that don't go back to front, because this goes back to front. The rails, where you work from the back to the front to bring them down, you don't necessarily scrape them that way, but you do work from back to front. And the channels, one would work from back to front. This, of course, you're going across the tip when you do the A, if you're just sanding near the tip. The only ones that go in a more diagonal scrape are the E, the far corner, which we leave till the very end, more of an end adjustment. The mid-tip scrape, like you were inscribing the more fingertip, thumbnail, I should say, rounded kind of tip shape. If you want to add some brightness to the sound, I don't advocate making a drastic look like this if you were to look under a light, but a few scrapes this way can bring more clarity to the sound, more brightness to the sound. But you will see that in these cases, if I had extended these lines a little more, you'd have fat V's, you might say. This V would be more it would be tighter, like sort of a normal V, but upside down, like we use in writing. This one would be a kind of an open V, almost more like a C, the letter C, but even maybe a little more concave than that, going out like that. As I said already, the A prime or the delta wing is more like the wings on those modern jets that have those more wide open stealth bombers or whatever that one can't see. And of course, the far corners, we have to be very careful to do it, not cut the corner off the reed. So those are the basic scrapes. And the idea behind this was I find people would tend to start blending in and kill this area of the reed. Too much white, if you looked in the light, going down to here. So that's why I came up with a system where much of the finishing of the reed is done back to front and then superimposed all these other adjustments. Now with the Barton cane, it's so close to being done, you're using very little of these adjustments. But for standard reed adjustment, this would still work. If we use the example on a reed, this poor reed that I destroyed for this process, you will see that I wrote a lot of those, the letters in here, the best I could. Sorry, it's not very good. But if you see, like from here, from E to E, that's the scrape, the far corner. The A would be sort of across from here to here if it were sanded, right? Straight across. The delta wing I'm talking about now is going from A to the A prime in the corner. So I'm lining up my knife on the corner and down like that. And the opposite would be here. Like I said already, if you were doing the far corners, I'd go from E to E, or E to EF, if you want to call it that. I did. E to EF, that would be the far corners. If I were going for the more popular mid-tip scrape, commonly used to get that rounded tip, then I'd have the knife, say, planted at this EF, and then I'm scraping in here, in this area, and getting that rounded shape that I showed you, right? If I do it, this EF to this EF. If I want the sharper cut, here's your E over here. I go about halfway across, and I'm pointing at the middle of the reed, right? I'm using that middle point at the tip, and I scrape. So those are the lineups. These are ways of helping you line up the front of the reed. And the other scrapes, I think, are more self-explanatory, and we'll talk about them. But I just thought maybe I could help map out the tip and its different scrapes a little better with this method.